It was 3:44 a.m. in the Taiwan Strait, and the surface of the water between the Chinese mainland and the island of Taiwan was running fast and dark under a northeast wind that had been building since midnight. 2-meter swells, irregular, the kind of chop that a large ship ignores entirely and a small vessel feels in every frame and weld. The strait was filled, as it always is at this hour, with the navigation lights of commercial shipping, container vessels, bulk carriers, ro-ro ships moving in both directions through the traffic separation scheme that the International Maritime Organization has maintained in these waters for decades. Among those lights, as of 47 minutes earlier, there were other lights, smaller, moving faster, and moving in a formation that had nothing to do with commercial transit and everything to do with what the People's Liberation Army Navy had been planning for the past 72 hours. USS Nimitz, CVN-68, the lead ship of the Nimitz class and the oldest nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in active service with the United States Navy, had entered the Taiwan Strait from the south at 11 p.m. the previous evening with Carrier Strike Group 11. The Nimitz had made this transit before. She had been making transits of contested and sensitive waters since her commissioning in 1975, and her crew, experienced, professional, and operating under a commanding officer who had more combined hours in carrier operations than most nations' entire naval aviation communities, was not a crew that approached a Taiwan Strait transit with anything resembling anxiety. They approached it with the thorough, methodical, systems-based readiness that defines U.S. Navy carrier operations in high-threat environments. Everything checked, everything manned, everything ready, and the specific additional measures that the Taiwan Strait threat environment requires layered on top of the standard at-sea posture. The strike group's composition on this transit was weighted for surface and air threat response. USS Princeton, CG-59, the Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, was positioned 8 nautical miles ahead of the Nimitz on the formation's northern axis, the direction from which a Chinese surface threat would most likely approach, given the geometry of the strait and the location of planned coastal naval bases on the mainland shore. 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, USS Higgins, DDG-76, USS Decatur, DDG-73, and USS Pinckney, DDG-91, held screening positions to port, starboard, and astern. The air wing was fully ready, F/A-18E and F/A-18F Super Hornets on alert, EA-18G Growlers warmed and crewed, and an E-2D Advanced Hawkeye that had been airborne since 10 p.m., providing continuous radar coverage of the strait from 24,000 feet. The E-2D's AN/APY-9 radar was painting the entire strait from the Chinese coast to the Taiwanese shore, with the kind of comprehensive, continuous picture that makes the concept of tactical surprise operationally meaningless against a carrier strike group operating with this level of support. At 2:57 a.m., the E-2D crew registered the first anomaly. Multiple surface contacts, small radar cross-sections, emerging from a point on the Chinese coast approximately 40 nautical miles northwest of the strait's center line, near the port of Fuzhou. The contacts were moving fast. Initial speed assessment placed them at 36 to 38 knots, which immediately eliminated commercial traffic as a classification option. At 36 knots in 2-meter chop, you're not a container ship. You're not a fishing vessel. At 36 knots in the Taiwan Strait at 3 a.m., moving from a planned coastal base on a bearing toward a U.S. carrier strike group, you are something that requires immediate and sustained attention. The E-2D crew classified the contacts at 2:59 a.m. Probable plan, type 022 Houbei-class missile boats, multiple units, formation spread consistent with a coordinated attack approach. The contact count was 12, then 14, then 16 as the E-2D's radar resolved individual vessels that had initially been merged in the surface clutter. 16 Type 022 Houbei-class missile boats inbound at 36 knots from the northwest. The data was on Link 16 and in the combat information centers of every ship in Carrier Strike Group 11 within 4 seconds of the E-2D's classification. The TAO aboard USS Princeton had the picture at 3 a.m. He called the captain. The captain of USS Princeton arrived in his CIC at 3:02 a.m., looked at 16 fast-moving surface contacts closing on the strike group at 36 knots, and told the TAO to coordinate the defensive response across the formation while he contacted the strike group commander. He was calm. Not performing calm, actually calm, in the way of a man who has spent 30 years preparing for exactly this scenario and finds, when it arrives, the preparation converts fear into focus. Let us spend a moment on the Type 022 Houbei-class missile boat, because understanding what it is and what it is not is essential to understanding why what happened next was inevitable. The Type 022 is a wave-piercing catamaran hull design, approximately 42.6 meters in length, displacing around 220 tons at full load, and powered by 4 diesel engines delivering a top speed of approximately 36 to 38 knots. She carries 8 YJ-83 anti-ship cruise missiles in 4 twin launchers amidships, a serious weapons load for a vessel of her size, and one that reflects the plan's asymmetric warfare doctrine of using large numbers of small, fast, heavily armed vessels to overwhelm the point defenses of a superior surface force through mass and speed. The YJ-83 has a range of approximately 180 kilometers in its latest variant, a 165-kilogram semi-armor-piercing warhead, and active radar terminal guidance. Against an undefended or lightly defended surface vessel, a coordinated salvo of YJ-83 missiles from 16 Type 022 boats, potentially 128 missiles simultaneously, is a genuine threat. The plan has invested heavily in this concept. The Type 022 force represents the most numerically significant fast attack craft flotilla in any navy in the world. Beijing believes in this platform. What Beijing's operational planners apparently had not fully accounted for, or had accounted for and chosen to test, was the specific combination of assets that Carrier Strike Group 11 had positioned for exactly this threat vector on exactly this transit. The Type 022's wave-piercing catamaran hull, while excellent for high-speed surface transit in moderate sea states, is not a stealthy platform. Its radar cross-section, while smaller than a conventional monohull vessel of comparable displacement, is not negligible to the AN/SPY-1B phased array radar aboard USS Princeton or the AN/APY-9 radar of the E-2D Hawkeye. At 3 a.m., 16 Type 022 boats moving at 36 knots in the spread formation generated radar returns that the E-2D classified with high confidence at 52 nautical miles from the strike group's lead element. 52 nautical miles. At 36 knots, that translates to approximately 87 minutes of engagement time before the lead boats could achieve their own YJ-83 weapons employment range. 87 minutes against the Aegis combat system is not a tactical problem. It is a targeting exercise. The Aegis combat system aboard USS Princeton began computing surface engagement solutions at 3:04 a.m. the moment the contact classification reached sufficient confidence for the system's threat evaluation algorithms to engage. The SPY-1B radar's surface search modes, augmented by the E-2D's elevated picture fed through the Cooperative Engagement Capability link, were tracking all 16 contacts with sufficient fidelity to support weapons assignment within 6 minutes of first detection. The system presented firing solutions to the TAO organized by threat priority, lead elements first, those with the best approach geometry and the earliest projected weapons employment windows, and a color-coded display that made the tactical picture as clear as a road map. At 3:11 a.m., 2FA 18F Super Hornets from VFA 41, the Black Aces, were launched from USS Nimitz's flight deck. The Black Aces carried AGM-64H Slammer standoff land attack missiles adapted for anti-surface employment, AGM-65 Maverick air-to-ground missiles for engagement of small surface combatants, and a full defensive air-to-air loadout of AIM-1 20D MROMs. Their mission was not to immediately engage the Type 022 formation. The geometry did not yet require it, but to establish an elevated sensor platform forward of the strike group's screen, providing the Aegis network with additional targeting data on the inbound formation and positioning for engagement authorization if the tactical situation required offensive response. The Black Aces were over the leading edge of the Type 022 formation at 3:24 a.m., 34 nautical miles northwest of the strike group. From 18,000 feet, with their AN/A PG-79 AESA radars active, they had every vessel in the formation on fire control quality track simultaneously. The Imogen from the Super Hornets AN/ASQ-228 ATFLIR targeting pods was being relayed through the tactical data network in real time, giving the strike group's CICs a visual picture of the Chinese formation to complement the radar track data, individual vessels identifiable, weapons launchers visible on deck, formation geometry, and spacing clear. The Black Aces were watching 16 Type 022 boats close on the strike group at 36 knots from a position of total informational dominance that the Chinese crews on those boats had no awareness of and no means to counter. The EA-18G Growler. Nobody had mentioned the Growler yet because, again, that is precisely how the EA-18G is supposed to operate. The electronic attack variant from VAQ-136, the Gauntlets, had been airborne since 3:08 a.m., orbiting 25 nautical miles south of the Type 022 formation at 20,000 feet. Its AN/ALQ-99 tactical jamming system and AN/ALQ-249 next-generation jammer pods running in passive collection mode. Listening to the electromagnetic emissions of 16 Chinese missile boats and building a precise electronic order of battle on their communications, radar, and data link systems before the jamming mission began. The Growler crew knew the frequency allocations of the Type 022's surface search radar. They knew the data link frequencies the boats were using to coordinate their formation. They knew the fire control radar frequency that a Type 022 would activate when it went to YJ-83 launch preparation. They knew all of this because the U.S. Navy has been collecting electronic intelligence on Chinese naval systems for decades, and the Gauntlet's mission computers held a library of Chinese naval emitter signatures that made the electromagnetic picture of 16 Type 022 boats as readable as a newspaper. At 3:31 a.m., the leading element of the Type 022 formation, 6 boats in a loose wedge, 28 nautical miles from the strike group's outer screen, activated their Type 3 6-2 fire control radars. The radar mode change was the electronic declaration of hostile intent. Fire control, radar activation against a U.S. carrier strike group in international waters. The Growler's passive receivers classified the emissions at 3:31 a.m. and 14 seconds. The AN/ALQ-249 NGJ pods when active at 3:31 a.m. and 22 seconds. 8 seconds after detection, the Growler crew had applied targeted jamming energy to all 6 active fire control radar systems simultaneously. The Chinese fire control radars went from coherent targeting solutions to noise floors in 1.4 seconds. On the displays aboard those 6 Type 022 boats, the Nimitz and her escorts simply disappeared. Not because the carrier had moved or maneuvered, but because the electromagnetic environment around the Chinese fire control systems had been altered to make coherent radar operation impossible. The YJ-83 missiles on the launchers of those 6 boats could not be fired at a target their guidance systems could not acquire. The weapons were real. The warheads were live. The launchers were trained. And the targeting picture that would have allowed those missiles to find the Nimitz was gone, replaced by electromagnetic interference that the Type 022's relatively simple electronic countermeasures support systems had no effective response to. At 3:33 a.m., USS Princeton fired. The surface engagement mode of the Aegis combat system employs the SM-2 Block 3B in its surface attack configuration, a non-standard employment of a missile primarily designed for air defense, but one that the Aegis system supports against surface targets when the tactical situation requires it. Or, in this case, the Naval Strike Missile, the NSM, which the Arleigh-Burke-class destroyers of this strike group had been equipped with as part of the over-the-horizon surface-to-surface engagement upgrade that the U.S. Navy had fielded in direct response to the PLAN fast attack craft threat. USS Higgins, the destroyer positioned on the strike group's port bow, had the best geometry against the lead formation element. Her NSM launchers, 4 missiles in ready configuration, were authorized at 3:33 a.m. The Naval Strike Missile is a subsonic sea-skimming anti-ship cruise missile with a range of 185 kilometers, a 120-kilogram penetrating warhead, an imaging infrared terminal seeker capable of discriminating between different vessel classes and aiming for specific aim points on the target hull, and a flight profile that takes it down to 3 to 5 meters above the wave tops in the terminal phase to complicate point defense engagement. The NSM does not rely on radar guidance in its terminal phase. It uses passive infrared imaging, meaning it generates no radar emissions that the target can detect before impact. For a Type 022 crew whose fire control radars have been jammed and whose data link connectivity to the formation has been degraded by the Growler's communications jamming, an NSM in terminal phase at 3 meters altitude generating no radar emissions is a threat they will not see until it is within visual range. The first NSM from USS Higgins covered 28 nautical miles at subsonic speed in approximately 6 minutes, sea skimming at 4 meters above the wave tops, its infrared seeker acquiring the lead Type 022's hull signature at 4 kilometers range and steering for the engine compartment. The aim point, the seeker had been trained to prioritize against this vessel class. The warhead's penetrating configuration drove through the catamaran hull before initiating. The Type 022's fuel system provided the secondary energy release. The vessel was rendered a total loss of asset within seconds of impact. The crew sustained fatal outcomes. Second NSM, second lead boat. Third, fourth, USS Higgins expended all 4 of her ready NSMs against the lead formation element in the span of 90 seconds, engaging 4 of the 6 boats in the leading wedge, while Princeton and Decatur engaged the 5th and 6th with their own NSM salvos. 6 Type 02, 2 boats in the lead element. 6 NSM impacts. 6 vessels rendered inoperable or total loss in the opening 90 seconds of the kinetic phase of the engagement. The remaining 10 Type 02, 2 boats broke formation. This is the moment that reveals the fundamental limitation of the Houbei-class swarm doctrine when it encounters an adversary that has had 87 minutes of warning and has used that time to position every asset in its defensive architecture for exactly this engagement. A swarm doctrine works when the swarm achieves surprise, when the targeted force does not have time to bring its full defensive capacity to bear before the swarm achieves weapons employment range. When the swarm does not achieve surprise, when the targeted force has had 87 minutes to position, arm, and authorize its response, the swarm is not a tactical asset. It is a target list. A long one, but still just a list. The 10 surviving Type 02, 2 boats dispersed on diverging headings, some turning northeast toward the Taiwanese coast, others breaking southwest back toward the Chinese mainland. 2 attempting to maintain their attack heading despite the loss of fire control radar lock and the disintegration of the lead element. The Black Aces were already repositioning. The Super Hornets descended from 18,000 feet to 8,000 feet and began engaging the dispersing boats with AGM-65 Maverick missiles. The Mavericks imaging infrared seeker acquiring the heat signature of each boat's diesel engine exhaust against the cold sea background, guiding to the engine compartment in the same aim point selection pattern that the NSMs had used. Each Maverick employment took less than 15 seconds from seeker acquisition to impact. The Black Aces carried 8 Mavericks between them. 8 more Type 02, 2 boats were rendered inoperable in the following 4 minutes. The 2 remaining boats, the 2 that had maintained their attack heading, their crews apparently committed to a weapons employment attempt despite the loss of their fire control radar picture and the destruction of 14 of their 16 formation members, were engaged by the Princeton's 5-inch Mark 45 gun mount at 11,000 yards. The gun mount's automated fire control system cycled through targeting solutions at a rate that allowed it to engage both vessels in sequence before either had closed to YJ-83 weapons employment range. The first boat was incapacitated by 2 5-inch rounds in the engine compartment at 3:41 a.m. The second was disabled by a single round that impacted the missile launcher housing and initiated the Ready missile's rocket motors without guidance. The YJ-83s that had been meant to neutralize the Nimitz streaked away on random headings and impacted the water 4 to 7 nautical miles from the engagement area. Harmless, expensive, and definitive in their failure. 16 Type 02, 2 Houbei-class missile boats. 16 rendered inoperable, disabled, or total loss of asset. 0 successful YJ-83 missile launches against any vessel in Carrier Strike Group 11. 0 impacts on American hulls. 0 casualties among American personnel. Elapsed time from first contact detection to last kinetic engagement, 44 minutes. The USS Nimitz continued her Taiwan Strait transit at her planned speed of advance. She did not alter course. Her flight deck operations, temporarily paused during the engagement's kinetic phase, resumed at 4:15 a.m. with the scheduled pre-dawn maintenance cycle. The Black Aces recovered aboard at 4:22 a.m. with 1 AGM-65 remaining between them. The 16th boat had been engaged by Princeton's gun before the Super Hornets could expend their final Maverick. The Growler recovered at 4:35 a.m. The E-2D continued its orbit. In the hours after the engagement, the plan's public affairs apparatus was silent. There was no announcement of a successful exercise. There was no claim of a demonstration of naval capability. 16 vessels had sortied from Fuzhou in the darkness and had not returned. The families of the crews knew what the state media did not say. The planned command structure knew what had happened with a completeness that the intelligence reporting would later confirm. Every boat had been tracked from departure. The entire approach had been observed. The Growler had denied them their fire control picture before a single YJ-83 could be aimed, and NSMs and Mavericks had worked through the formation with the systematic efficiency of a weapons system that had been designed for exactly this target type in exactly this geographic and tactical environment. The Taiwan Strait remained open. USS Nimitz completed her transit and entered the Philippine Sea at 6:44 a.m., her crew standing down from the heightened readiness posture that had been maintained since the first Type 022 contacts appeared on the E-2D's display 6 hours earlier. The strike group continued its scheduled operations. The VLS expenditure and NSM count were logged for resupply. The after-action data from the Growler's collection run, the complete electronic signatures of 16 Type 022 boats' radar and communication systems under operational conditions, was transmitted to the relevant intelligence commands before the ship's crew had eaten breakfast. The plan's fast attack craft doctrine is built on an assumption that mass compensates for individual capability, that 16 or 60 or 160 small boats, each carrying 8 anti-ship missiles, can overwhelm any defensive system through sheer volume of fire. The assumption has theoretical validity in scenarios where the attacking force achieves surprise and the defending force has no advanced warning, no elevated radar coverage, no electronic warfare support, and no standoff anti-surface weapons capable of engaging the attacking force before it reaches its own weapons employment range. In the Taiwan Strait, against a carrier strike group with an E-2D Hawkeye, providing continuous radar coverage from 24,000 feet, an EA-18G Growler carrying the most advanced airborne electronic attack system ever built, Naval Strike Missiles on the wing stations of every escort destroyer, and an Aegis combat system that had been computing firing solutions for 87 minutes before the first NSM left its launcher. That scenario does not exist. 16 boats sent toward the Nimitz, 16 boats that will not go home, and the Taiwan Strait, as it always has been and always will be when American carriers choose to sail through it, remained exactly what it is: international water. Bye for now.